This weapon was supposed to end the war in a single stroke. At least, that's what Germany's leaders believed. They spoke about it in guarded rooms and private meetings, as if the right machine could bend history itself. They imagined a single invention so advanced, so terrifying, that enemy nations would lose the will to fight. They said it would make armies retreat without firing a shot, make cities surrender before bombs even fell, make the world stare in disbelief at German science. It was described as faster than anything in the sky, stronger than anything on the ground, smarter, deadlier, more modern than any weapon ever built. There was just one quiet problem. It barely worked. Engines failed before reaching battle. Weapons jammed at the worst moments. Fuel ran out before missions even began. And the men ordered to operate these machines sometimes feared their own equipment more than the enemy trying to kill them. Germany had begun to believe something dangerous. That technology alone could save a collapsing war. By 1943, the war did not look like it once had. The early lightning victories were gone. The fast advances, the confident speeches, the sense of unstoppable momentum, all of it had faded into long casualty lists and shrinking maps. German cities were being bombed day and night. Factory roofs burned. Rail lines twisted under explosions. Oil supplies, the lifeblood of modern war, were disappearing. Experienced pilots and veteran soldiers were dying faster than they could ever be replaced. The war machine that once roared forward now moved like an engine running out of oil. Slower, louder, more fragile. And when powerful nations begin to lose, they often turn to desperate ideas. Inside Germany's leadership, a belief started to grow stronger than reality. If normal weapons and normal strategies were failing, then only something extraordinary could change the outcome. Not more soldiers, not better planning, but a miracle. They began pouring enormous resources into secret research programs. Laboratories worked through the night. Engineers were pushed to skip steps, rush tests, and promise results no one could guarantee. These inventions were given a dramatic name: wonder weapons. The name itself carried hope. Hope that science could do what armies could not. But hope is not the same as readiness. Many of these machines existed only as drawings months earlier. Some had barely been tested outside controlled conditions. Some were so complex that even the people designing them did not fully understand how they would behave under combat stress. Engineers quietly warned their superiors. They explained that these weapons needed more development, more materials, more time. But time had become the one resource Germany no longer had. So the decision was made again and again: send them anyway. One of the most famous of these supposed miracle weapons looked like it had arrived from decades in the future. Sleek, sharp, unlike the propeller-driven aircraft that had filled the skies since the beginning of flight. This was the jet fighter. To those who first saw it, the shape alone was shocking. Smooth metal skin, engines mounted under the wings. A design built for speed, not elegance. When it flew, it did something no other operational fighter could do at the time. It outran almost everything. Enemy pilots reported seeing it streak past like a flash of light. By the time they tried to turn and chase, it was already gone. It could dive into bomber formations, fire devastating weapons, and disappear before escort fighters could react. On paper, it was exactly the kind of machine Germany dreamed of. A weapon that seemed to belong to the future, unleashed into a present that was not ready for it. But the future has requirements, and Germany could no longer meet them. Jet engines were incredibly advanced pieces of machinery. They required metals that could survive extreme heat and stress. Earlier in the war, Germany had access to higher quality materials. Now those sources were gone or cut off. So engineers were forced to make compromises. They used substitute metals that looked fine at first glance, but inside the engines, under intense heat, they wore down quickly. Blades warped. Parts cracked. Systems that were supposed to last hundreds of hours sometimes struggled to last a few dozen. Pilots were given an aircraft that was both revolutionary and unreliable at the same time. Imagine climbing into the fastest fighter in the world, knowing the engines behind you might fail without warning, knowing that pushing them too hard could destroy them, knowing that even a small mistake in throttle control could cause damage that could not be repaired in the air. Speed had been achieved. Trust had not. Then came another layer of trouble: fuel. Jet engines consumed fuel at a frightening rate. Germany's fuel situation, meanwhile, was collapsing. Oil fields had been captured. Synthetic fuel plants were being bombed relentlessly. Training flights were reduced. Missions were limited not by strategy, but by how much fuel remained in storage tanks. Airfields began to fill with aircraft that represented the cutting edge of aviation. That could not fly. Perfectly functional jets sat silent because there was nothing to put in their tanks. Mechanics could prepare them. Pilots could be ready. But without fuel, they were just expensive metal sculptures. A miracle weapon grounded by shortages. And then, just when the aircraft might have found a role where its speed could make a real difference, another decision changed its fate. Instead of using it primarily to defend German skies by attacking enemy bombers, leadership insisted it also be used as a fast bomber itself. Bomb racks were added. Weight increased. Handling changed. Performance suffered. A machine designed for one purpose was forced into another, less suitable role. Even when Germany created something genuinely advanced, how it was used often reduced its effectiveness. This pattern repeated again and again across different projects. Germany chased complexity at a time when it desperately needed simplicity. It built machines that required skilled maintenance, rare materials, and stable supply chains. Exactly the things it was losing. Meanwhile, the basic tools that keep an army functioning, trucks, spare parts, reliable engines, trained mechanics, became scarcer and scarcer. It was like building a race car while the roads were crumbling. To outside observers, these new weapons sounded terrifying. Intelligence reports spoke of revolutionary aircraft, secret projects, machines that might change everything. But on the ground, reality felt different. Mechanics struggled to keep engines running. Pilots worried about failures more than dogfights. Commanders faced the same constant limits. Not enough fuel, not enough parts, not enough time to train replacements. The weapons looked like the future. The war around them looked like collapse. Germany was investing in machines designed for a long, stable future war, while losing a short, brutal present one. And the deeper they leaned into these miracle solutions, the more they neglected the boring, unglamorous systems that actually. Because soon, the obsession with size and power would move from the skies to the ground, where engineers would build a vehicle so enormous, so heavy, and so impractical, that it proved a devastating lesson. A weapon can look unstoppable, and still be useless. If speed in the sky was supposed to save the war, then power on the ground was meant to crush it into submission. As Germany's situation worsened, another belief took hold among its leaders. If their tanks could become big enough, heavy enough, and terrifying enough, no enemy would be able to stand against them. Bigger guns, thicker armor, larger machines. The logic sounded simple. If one tank was strong, then a tank twice as large must be unstoppable. Engineers were ordered to think beyond limits. Bridges, roads, transport, fuel consumption. These practical concerns were treated like small details that could be solved later. What mattered now was psychological shock. They wanted a machine that would make enemy soldiers freeze at the sight of it. That machine would become one of the most extreme armored vehicles ever seriously built. A super heavy tank, so large it barely seemed real. Its armor was so thick that most standard anti-tank weapons of the time would struggle to penetrate it from the front. Its main gun was massive, designed to destroy enemy tanks from long distances. On paper, it looked invincible. There was just one problem. War doesn't happen on paper. The tank was so heavy that normal bridges couldn't support it. If it needed to cross a river, engineers had to think about driving it along the riverbed instead, like some kind of metal submarine crawling underwater. Transporting it by rail was a nightmare. Special arrangements were needed. Routes had to be planned carefully. Just getting it from factory to battlefield was an operation of its own. And then there was the ground itself. Battlefields are not smooth highways. They are mud, rubble, craters, broken roads, and soft earth churned by artillery and rain. All that weight pressed down onto the tracks. If the ground was soft, the vehicle risked sinking or becoming stuck. Recovering a machine that heavy, under enemy fire, was nearly impossible. So a tank designed to dominate the battlefield might not even reach it. Fuel consumption was another quiet disaster. Moving something that massive required enormous amounts of fuel. The very resource Germany was running out of everywhere. A single super heavy tank could consume as much fuel as several smaller vehicles combined. It was a symbol of power that drank like a fleet. And even if it did reach combat, new problems waited. Turning such a heavy vehicle put enormous stress on its mechanical parts. Transmissions, suspension systems, engines, all of them were pushed to their limits. Breakdowns were not rare possibilities. They were expected events. Now imagine being part of the crew. You sit inside a metal fortress protected by thick armor, holding a gun powerful enough to destroy almost anything you can see. But you also know that if something breaks, and something probably will, you might be stuck in place. And a stationary tank, no matter how well armored, becomes a target for artillery, aircraft, or engineers with explosives. Invincible did not mean mobile. And in modern war, mobility is survival. While enormous resources went into designing and building these giants, factories that could have produced multiple reliable medium tanks instead were tied up with complex, slow, difficult projects. Time, materials, and labor were poured into a handful of machines instead of hundreds of simpler ones. Germany was betting on a few monsters instead of many workhorses. Meanwhile, Allied forces focused on vehicles that were easier to produce, easier to repair, and easier to transport. They might not have looked as intimidating one-on-one, but they showed up in large numbers day after day. War is not just about who has the strongest punch. It is about who can keep punching. The super heavy tank became a perfect example of a weapon designed to win a dramatic duel, but not a long campaign. It was built for the idea of war, not the reality of it. And perhaps the most telling detail of all is this. These massive machines were talked about with awe. They appeared in reports, in rumors, in propaganda. They became symbols of technological ambition. But their actual impact on the war was almost nothing. Too few were built, too difficult to deploy, too impractical to influence the fast-moving, fuel-hungry, chaotic nature of modern combat. They represented the same pattern seen in the skies with the jets. Advanced, impressive, intimidating, but disconnected from the crumbling system that was supposed to support them. Germany was building weapons for a fantasy version of the war. A war where supply lines were stable, fuel was plentiful, and machines could be maintained without interruption. The real war was mud, shortages, constant bombing, and exhausted crews trying to keep broken equipment alive one more day. And the bigger these wonder weapons became, the more fragile the system behind them looked. Because a weapon does not fight alone. It needs fuel, spare parts, trained crews, safe transport, repair facilities, time. Germany had less of all of these with each passing month. So the giant tank, like the revolutionary jet, became another symbol of a dangerous illusion. That one perfect machine could replace an entire failing war economy. It couldn't. And as leaders continued chasing dramatic breakthroughs, another kind of wonder weapon was being prepared. One that didn't crawl across battlefields or roar through the sky. It would rise almost straight upward, powered by fire. A rocket meant not to win battles, but to terrorize cities from far beyond the reach of defenses. And it too would promise everything, while hiding problems that made its success far smaller than its legend. While giant tanks struggled to move and jet fighters struggled to stay in the air, German scientists were working on something that didn't need a runway, a road, or even a crew on board. It would rise straight into the sky on a pillar of fire. A rocket that could travel faster than sound, higher than any aircraft, too fast to be intercepted once launched. It was presented as the ultimate revenge weapon, a way to strike enemy cities from far away, without risking pilots, without facing fighter defenses, without warning. Leaders believed this new weapon would change the psychology of war. If cities could be hit without sirens, without aircraft overhead, without any chance to stop it, then fear alone might break civilian morale. This was the V2 rocket. It looked like something from the future. Tall, smooth, deadly. A weapon powered not by propellers or wheels, but by liquid fuel engines that roared like controlled explosions. When it worked, it was terrifying. It climbed high into the atmosphere, then fell toward its target faster than the speed of sound. There was no engine noise before impact. No chance to take cover after hearing it. The explosion came first. The sound followed. To those on the receiving end, it felt unstoppable. But behind the launch sites, the story was very different. The W2 was incredibly complex. It required precise fueling, delicate guidance systems, and careful handling of volatile propellants. The fuels themselves were dangerous. Leaks, mishandling, or small mistakes could cause explosions before the rocket ever left the ground. Launch crews worked under constant pressure, racing against advancing enemy forces, moving equipment again and again to avoid being captured. Conditions were chaotic. Mistakes happened. Some rockets exploded during preparation. Some veered off course. Some failed shortly after launch and crashed harmlessly or disastrously in the wrong place. And each rocket required enormous resources, specialized parts, transport vehicles, trained technicians, fuel that Germany could barely afford to spare. For every rocket launched, there was a hidden cost in materials and effort that could have supported more conventional weapons. The guidance system, advanced for its time, was still primitive by modern standards. The rockets were not precise. They were aimed at cities, not specific military targets. Their purpose was terror more than strategy. And terror is hard to measure. Yes, the rockets caused fear. Yes, they caused destruction. But they did not stop the Allied advance. They did not cripple enemy industry. They did not force surrender. They were technologically brilliant and strategically limited. There was another dark side, too, one rarely mentioned in triumphant announcements. The production of these rockets relied heavily on forced labor under brutal conditions. Prisoners were made to build advanced weapons in underground factories, suffering and dying in huge numbers. The human cost of the program was staggering. So while leaders spoke of miracle weapons and scientific triumphs, the reality included misery, exhaustion, and death far from the front lines. Even from a purely military perspective, the W2 revealed the same core problem as the jets and super heavy tanks. It was too complex for the situation Germany was in. It needed stable supply lines, secure facilities, time for careful preparation. Instead, it was used in a collapsing war zone, rushed, relocated, and pushed into action under pressure. Each launch looked dramatic. Flames, smoke, thunder. A weapon that seemed to leap into the future. But each one was also a reminder that Germany was investing in spectacular strikes instead of sustainable warfare. The rockets did not protect German cities from bombing. They did not stop enemy armies pushing closer from east and west. They did not solve the fuel crisis or the shortage of trained pilots. They were symbols. Loud ones. Impressive ones. But symbols do not hold territory. And by the time the rockets were flying in significant numbers, the war's outcome was already leaning heavily in one direction. Germany had created the world's first long-range ballistic missile. A technological milestone. A terrifying weapon. And still not enough to change the ending. The pattern was now impossible to ignore. In the air, revolutionary jets that broke down. On the ground, massive tanks that could barely move. From hidden launch sites, rockets that shocked the world but couldn't stop defeat. Each one promised to be the turning point. Each one arrived too late, in too few numbers, with too many problems. And still, the search for miracle solutions continued. Because when reality grows darker, leaders sometimes chase bigger dreams instead of harder truths. In the next part, the focus shifts to the sea, where advanced submarines were designed to hunt enemy shipping in new ways, but faced mechanical limits, training shortages, and a war that was already turning against them. Even beneath the waves, the story would be the same. Brilliant ideas, crushing pressure, and machines that could not carry the weight of impossible expectations. By the time Germany turned its hopes toward the sea again, the war had already shifted in ways that were hard to reverse. Earlier in the conflict, submarines had been one of Germany's most feared weapons. Silent hunters slipping through the Atlantic, striking cargo ships, cutting off supplies, creating fear far from the battlefield. For a while it worked. Merchant ships burned, supply routes trembled, and the ocean felt dangerous. But war, like technology, evolves. By the later years, the oceans were no longer easy hunting grounds. Allied forces had improved radar, sonar, air patrols, and escort tactics. Submarines that once prowled with confidence now faced constant detection. So once again, Germany searched for a technological leap. A new kind of submarine that would restore dominance underwater the same way jets were supposed to dominate the sky. Engineers designed advanced U-boats that were far ahead of earlier models. Sleeker shapes for better underwater speed. Larger batteries for longer submerged travel. Systems that would allow them to stay hidden beneath the surface instead of surfacing frequently, where aircraft could find them. On paper, these submarines looked like the future of naval warfare. They could travel underwater faster than many ships could move above. They could remain submerged longer. They had improved sensors and new ideas meant to give them an edge. There was just one problem. The future had arrived, but the present was falling apart. These advanced submarines were extremely complex. They required careful construction, skilled crews, and long training periods. But Germany was running out of experienced sailors. Veteran crews had been lost over years of brutal Atlantic warfare. So many of the men assigned to these new boats were young, rushed through training, and expected to handle machines more complicated than anything previous generations had used. Inside a submarine, small mistakes can become deadly fast. Life underwater is already tense. Air is limited. Space is tight. Machinery hums constantly. Every system matters: engines, batteries, air purification, ballast controls. In the newer boats, there were more systems than ever before. More things that could go wrong. And they did. Mechanical failures at sea were terrifying. A malfunctioning valve. A leaking seal. Electrical problems with the batteries that powered underwater movement. If something broke while submerged, the crew might have minutes to fix it before the situation became life-threatening. Batteries, in particular, were a quiet danger. They produced gases that had to be carefully managed. Leaks or poor ventilation could create poisonous air or even risk explosions. Crews had to trust their equipment completely. But the equipment was often built under pressure in bombed factories by overworked laborers using materials that were no longer top quality. Even before reaching enemy waters, some submarines struggled with reliability. And then there was the problem of time. These new submarines were being completed late in the war, when Allied control of the seas and skies was stronger than ever. Ports were bombed. Shipyards were attacked. Just getting a submarine out to open ocean had become a dangerous journey. Aircraft patrolled coastlines. Radar stations watched for movement. Mines blocked routes. The path from dock to deep water was no longer safe. So a machine designed for long, stealthy patrols sometimes faced its greatest danger before it even began its mission. When these submarines did reach the Atlantic, they faced a battlefield that had changed. Convoys were better protected. Escort ships had improved weapons and tactics. Aircraft with long range could patrol areas once considered safe for submarines. The ocean, once a hunting ground, had become a trap. The advanced submarines could dive deeper and move faster underwater than older models. But they still had limits. Batteries drained. Air ran low. Eventually, they had to surface or use snorkels, devices that allowed diesel engines to run while mostly submerged. Snorkels sounded like a clever solution, but they created new risks. They could be detected by radar. They could malfunction. Rough seas could flood them, damaging engines or forcing emergency dives. So even the solutions brought new dangers. Inside these submarines, the psychological pressure was immense. Long patrols in cramped spaces. Constant fear of detection. The knowledge that if depth charges exploded too close, the hull might crack, and the sea would rush in with unstoppable force. Now add unreliable machinery to that stress. A submarine is not like a tank that can stop and wait for repairs. It is not like a plane that can glide down to land. Underwater, failure can mean sinking beyond recovery. The promise had been clear. New submarines would turn the tide in the Atlantic again. The reality was harsher. Too few boats were ready in time. Crews were inexperienced. Mechanical issues reduced effectiveness. And the Allied anti-submarine network had grown too strong. Once again, a technological leap had arrived into a situation where the system around it could no longer support success. Germany kept building weapons designed for a long, sustainable war of innovation and production. But by now, it was fighting a desperate defensive struggle, with shrinking resources and constant pressure from every direction. The submarines were marvels of engineering for their time, but they were introduced into a sea that no longer belonged to them. And so the pattern continued. In the air, speed without reliability. On land, size without mobility. In the sky above cities, rockets without strategic impact. Underwater, advanced submarines without the conditions needed to truly succeed. Each weapon looked like a turning point. Each one was too late, too fragile, or too limited to change the outcome. And still, the belief in miracle solutions did not die. Because when defeat feels close, the dream of one last breakthrough becomes hard to let go of. In the final part, we step back from individual machines and look at the bigger collapse behind them. The factories, the fuel, the transport, the missing pieces that no wonder weapon could replace. Because in the end, the greatest failure was not a single machine. It was the belief that machines alone could win a war that was already being lost everywhere else. By the final years of the war, Germany had built machines that looked like they belonged to the future. Jet fighters that broke the sound barrier of their time. Rockets that reached the edge of space. Submarines designed to stay hidden beneath the sea for longer than ever before. Tanks so massive they looked indestructible. On posters, in speeches, in secret reports, these weapons sounded like salvation. But war is not won by how weapons look. It is won by whether they can be built in large numbers, maintained, fueled, repaired, and replaced when they are lost. And this is where the illusion finally shattered. Germany's greatest weakness was no longer at the front lines. It was behind them. Factories were being bombed faster than they could be rebuilt. Rail lines that carried steel, fuel, and parts were constantly cut. Trains were delayed, destroyed, or forced to reroute through longer, slower paths. A tank factory might finish a powerful new vehicle, only to have no working rail line to deliver it. An airfield might receive advanced jet fighters, but not enough trained mechanics to keep them flying. A submarine might be ready for patrol, but lack experienced sailors to operate its complex systems. Every wonder weapon depended on a network, fuel refineries, transportation systems, training programs, spare parts production, repair depots, and that network was collapsing piece by piece. Even simple things became rare. Rubber for tires, quality steel, copper for wiring, lubricants for engines. Each shortage created delays, compromises, and breakdowns. Engines wore out faster because materials were lower quality. Repairs took longer because parts were missing. Vehicles were abandoned not because they were destroyed in battle, but because they could not be fixed in time. Meanwhile, Allied forces focused on reliability and scale. They built weapons that were easier to produce, easier to maintain, and easier to transport across oceans. Their factories ran day and night, mostly beyond the reach of bombing. Their supply lines grew stronger while Germany's shrank. So while Germany produced machines that looked superior in design, the Allies produced systems that were superior in endurance. And endurance is what wins long wars. The obsession with miracle weapons slowly turned into a distraction. Resources that could have strengthened defenses, improved logistics, or supported existing forces were poured into complex projects that arrived too late or in numbers too small to matter. Leaders kept hoping for a single breakthrough moment, a weapon that would shock the enemy into negotiation. But wars of this scale are not ended by surprise alone. They are decided by production, supply, and the ability to replace losses faster than the opponent. Germany's advanced machines often required hours of maintenance for every hour of operation. They needed specialized parts, trained technicians, and careful handling. In a stable economy, this might have been manageable. In a collapsing one, it was impossible. The gap between vision and reality grew wider every month. Pilots admired their jets, but worried about engine failures. Tank crews trusted their armor, but feared mechanical breakdowns. Submarine crews believed in their boats, but knew one small malfunction underwater could be fatal. The machines were powerful. The system supporting them was not. In the end, the wonder weapons did not fail because the ideas behind them were foolish. Many of them were technologically brilliant, far ahead of their time. Some designs influenced post-war engineering for decades. They failed because they were built for a future that Germany would never reach. They required time, stability, and resources that no longer existed. They were answers to a different kind of war than the one actually being fought. And perhaps the greatest twist of all is this. The more Germany chased extraordinary solutions, the more it neglected the ordinary foundations that actually sustain military power. Fuel over fantasy, logistics over legend, reliability over spectacle. Those are not exciting slogans, but they win wars. When the fighting finally ended, many of the wonder weapons remained rare, unfinished, or only lightly used. They became museum pieces, engineering milestones, and historical curiosities rather than war-winning tools. They proved something important and sobering. A machine can be revolutionary, and still irrelevant if the world around it is falling apart. In the quiet after the war, these weapons stood as reminders of a dangerous belief, that technology alone can rescue a nation from strategic failure. It cannot, because even the most advanced weapon ever built still depends on the simplest things. Fuel in the tank, parts that fit, people who are trained, and a system strong enough to keep everything moving. Without those, even a weapon from the future becomes just another piece of metal, waiting for a war it cannot win. This is another story of a weapon that looked unstoppable until nature stepped in. The tank was built to dominate battlefields. It had thick armor designed to shrug off enemy fire, a powerful cannon meant to destroy anything in its path, a roaring engine built to push tons of steel across fields, roads, and shattered towns. When it rolled forward, the ground shook. When its gun fired, enemy crews often bailed out before the second shot. In photographs and propaganda films, it looked like the future of warfare. Heavy, confident, indestructible. It seemed like a machine that feared nothing. But there was one enemy it had never truly been designed to fight. Winter. Not soldiers. Not artillery. Not aircraft. Cold. The kind of cold that freezes breath in midair. That turns mud into iron. That seeps into metal and changes how machines behave from the inside out. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the plan was built around speed. Move fast. Strike hard. Collapse resistance before the campaign dragged into another year. They had done it before. Poland fell quickly. France fell quickly. The formula seemed proven. Tanks would lead the way again. Fast-moving armored columns punching through defenses, surrounding enemy forces, never giving them time to recover. But the land to the east was not like Western Europe. It was wider, rougher, less developed. Roads were fewer, and many were just dirt tracks. Distances between supply depots stretched longer and longer as the advance continued. At first, the tanks did what they were designed to do. Their guns outmatched many opponents. Their armor gave crews confidence. Engines roared, tracks clattered, and villages, fields, and forests rolled past in clouds of dust. Crews believed in their machines. Commanders trusted them to break through again and again. Then autumn arrived. Rain began to fall, not in quick storms, but in long, soaking days that turned the ground into a thick, sticky trap. Dirt roads dissolved into deep mud. Fields became swamps. Vehicles that had moved easily in dry weather now struggled to crawl forward. Tracks spun uselessly. Mud packed into wheels and suspension systems. Engines had to work harder just to move a few meters. Fuel consumption rose sharply. Wear and tear increased. Recovery vehicles were called constantly to pull stuck tanks free. This was the first warning. The battlefield itself could be an enemy. But mud still allowed movement, even if slow. With effort, machines could be dragged forward. Repairs could be made. Progress, though painful, continued. Then the temperature dropped. At first, the cold felt like relief. The mud began to harden. Frozen ground meant better traction. Vehicles could move more easily again. But this was only the beginning, because when the ground froze, the cold did not stop there. It moved into the machines. Metal does not behave the same way in extreme cold. Oil does not flow the same. Rubber does not bend the same. Batteries do not deliver power the same way. Every system inside a tank depends on physical properties that engineers design for certain conditions. The Russian winter pushed those conditions far beyond what many vehicles had been built for. Night temperatures plunged lower and lower. Cold crept into engines, transmissions, fuel lines, and electrical systems. A tank left overnight in the open did not simply get cold on the outside. Its entire mechanical heart stiffened. Morning became a battle before the battle. Crews climbed out into darkness, breath freezing in the air, fingers going numb in seconds. They tried to start engines that had run fine the day before. The starter motors strained. Engines coughed, groaned, or refused to turn at all. Oil inside had thickened so much that moving parts struggled against resistance they were never meant to face. Sometimes crews had to build small fires beneath the engine compartments, carefully warming the metal just enough to make the oil flow again. Too much heat in the wrong place could cause damage. Too little, and the engine would not start. Imagine preparing to face enemy fire, and your first fight is convincing your own machine to wake up. Fuel lines could freeze. Water condensation in systems turned to ice, blocking flow. Batteries weakened dramatically in the cold, losing the power needed to start heavy engines. Rubber seals became brittle and cracked. Hydraulic systems slowed or failed. Grease hardened, turning smooth movement into grinding resistance. Turrets that once rotated quickly could become sluggish, making it harder to aim in fast-moving situations. A tank is not just armor and a gun. It is a network of moving parts, all depending on each other. When one system slows, others strain. When several struggle at once, failure spreads. Cold attacked everything at the same time. And unlike enemy fire, you could not shoot back at it. Weapons were affected too. Metal parts contracted, changing how mechanisms fit together. Recoil systems behaved differently. Sights fogged or froze. Ammunition had to be handled carefully, because extreme temperatures could affect performance. Even opening and closing hatches could become difficult when ice formed along edges. Repairs in these conditions were miserable and slow. Tools stuck to bare skin. Fingers lost feeling. Small parts were hard to grip. Tasks that might take an hour in summer could take half a day in freezing winds. Spare parts froze in storage. Lubricants were not always the right type for such low temperatures. Crews improvised, adapted, did whatever they could to keep their machines running. But every delay meant fewer tanks ready for movement, fewer ready for battle. And the enemy did not stop just because engines were frozen. Fuel shortages made everything worse. To prevent engines from freezing solid, crews sometimes kept them idling. But idling consumed precious fuel that was already hard to deliver across long, vulnerable supply lines. Turning engines off saved fuel, but risked not being able to start them again. So crews faced a cruel choice every night. Burn fuel just to survive the cold, or save fuel and risk becoming a frozen, silent target by morning. The tank that had been designed to dominate battlefields now fought a daily battle against temperature, oil viscosity, metal contraction, and frozen ground. And physics was winning. German planners had expected a fast campaign. They had not prepared enough vehicles, supplies, and modified equipment for a long winter wore this deep into harsh territory. Cold weather lubricants, insulated components, and specialized maintenance procedures existed. But not in the quantities needed, not everywhere, not for an army stretched so far. The deeper the advance went, the worse the conditions became, and the weaker the support behind it grew. German planners had expected a fast campaign. They had not prepared enough vehicles, supplies, and modified equipment for a long winter wore this deep into harsh territory. Cold weather lubricants, insulated components, and specialized maintenance procedures existed, but not in the quantities needed, not everywhere, not for an army stretched so far. The deeper the advance went, the worse the conditions became, and the weaker the support behind it grew. A powerful tank is only powerful when it can move, shoot, and be repaired. Winter attacked all three, and as the cold deepened, a quiet realization spread among crews. The enemy in front of them was dangerous, but the cold inside their own machines was something they could not outfight. At first, the cold only delayed things. Engines took longer to start. Repairs took longer to finish. Movements were slower, more cautious. Crews grumbled, adapted, pushed forward anyway. Soldiers are used to discomfort. Machines, however, are less forgiving. As the weeks passed and temperatures dropped further, the cold stopped being a daily obstacle and became a constant mechanical assault. Metal doesn't just get cold, it changes. It contracts. Clearances inside engines and gear systems, carefully measured in factories, grew tighter. Parts that once moved smoothly now scraped and resisted. Wear increased. Failures became more frequent. Gearboxes began to suffer. Shifting gears in extreme cold could grind teeth that were never meant to meet that way. Lubrication failed to reach every corner in time. Small stresses turned into cracked components. A tank might still run, but every kilometer pushed it closer to a breakdown that might not be reparable in the field. Suspension systems, already under huge strain from the tank's weight, stiffened. Shock absorbers lost effectiveness. Tracks became more brittle, and metal under stress is more likely to snap when it's frozen hard. Then came another problem: weapons that worked in theory, but not in practice. Tank guns rely on recoil systems to absorb the force of firing. In extreme cold, the fluids and mechanisms involved did not behave the same way. Recoil could feel harsher. Parts wore faster. Maintenance intervals that were acceptable in warm weather suddenly became too long. Machine guns mounted on tanks jammed more often. Grease thickened. Springs reacted differently. A weapon that might fire perfectly in summer could misfeed at the worst possible moment in winter. The enemy did not need to destroy the tank. Time and temperature were already working on it. Then winter added a new ally: visibility. Snow fell, then more snow, then storms that erased roads and landmarks. Tracks disappeared under fresh layers overnight. Navigation became harder. Vehicles strayed off safe paths and found themselves stuck in ditches, snowdrifts, or weak ice. A tank stuck in mud could sometimes be pulled free. A tank buried in snow, with its engine refusing to start, was another matter. Crews dug with shovels, hands, anything they had. Engines were coaxed, begged, cursed at. Sometimes they started. Sometimes they didn't. And while all this happened, the enemy was adapting. Soviet forces were used to winter. Their equipment, clothing, and logistics were better prepared for the cold. They used skis, sleds, and winter camouflage. Their tanks, not perfect, but more suited to local conditions, moved across frozen terrain with fewer issues. For German crews, winter meant survival first, combat second. For Soviet forces, winter was a familiar environment, one they could fight in. A tank that cannot move is no longer a weapon of breakthrough. It becomes a fixed position, a target, a problem. Artillery crews learned to watch for stalled or slow-moving vehicles. Aircraft looked for clusters of machines gathered for repairs. A single breakdown could expose a whole unit. Recovery became more dangerous than advance. Towing a disabled tank in summer was hard. In deep snow, under freezing winds, with enemy fire nearby, it could be nearly impossible. Cables snapped. Engines overheated trying to pull dead weight through resistance. So more tanks were abandoned. Not destroyed in glorious battles. Not knocked out by enemy guns. Simply broken, frozen, or out of fuel. Each abandoned vehicle was more than metal lost. It was a crew on foot. A gap in the line. A reduction in firepower that could not easily be replaced. And replacements were not arriving quickly. Supply lines stretched across vast distances struggled even more in winter. Trucks broke down. Fuel froze in storage. Rail lines were damaged or delayed. Spare parts that might save a tank sat hundreds of kilometers away, unreachable. So crews cannibalized. One disabled tank became spare parts for another. A vehicle that might have been reparable in a proper workshop became a donor, slowly stripped of useful pieces in the snow. The powerful armored spearhead that had once driven forward with confidence began to look thinner, more fragile, more dependent on a shrinking number of functioning machines. And the psychological effect was just as serious as the mechanical one. Tank crews trust their vehicles. That trust is part of their courage. When a crew believes their armor will protect them and their engine will carry them out of danger, they fight differently. Winter eroded that trust. Every strange noise from the engine raised fear. Every delay in starting felt like a threat. Every long halt in freezing temperatures meant another chance the machine might not wake up again. Instead of charging forward with confidence, crews worried about whether they would even reach the battlefield. The tank had been designed as a symbol of unstoppable movement. Now it was fighting to move at all. And perhaps the cruelest twist was this. The cold did not just weaken machines. It slowed decision-making, reduced coordination, and increased exhaustion. Frozen radios, stiff controls, numb hands. Everything took more effort. Everything took more time. War rewards speed and flexibility. Winter stole both. So while the tank still looked terrifying in photographs, thick armor, long gun barrel, tracks ready to bite into the earth, its true enemy was already inside it, in every drop of thickened oil, every brittle seal, every frozen line. It had been built to defeat armies. It was not built to defeat nature. And nature does not retreat. By now, the cold had done more than slow the tanks. It had changed how the entire battlefield moved. Armored units that were meant to punch through enemy lines and keep driving forward now had to think about distance differently. Every kilometer traveled meant more fuel burned, just to keep engines alive. Every stop risked another frozen start. Every delay gave the enemy time to regroup. Speed had been the key to earlier victories. Winter stole speed. Commanders began planning operations not just around enemy positions, but around temperature. Could the engine start tomorrow morning? Would the fuel still flow? Would recovery vehicles even reach a breakdown site in time? A tank unit that once measured success in how far it advanced now measured it in how many vehicles were still running at the end of the day. And while machines struggled, the enemy began to push back. Soviet forces launched counterattacks at moments when German vehicles were least mobile, after long nights of freezing temperatures, when engines were hardest to start and crews were most exhausted. Infantry supported by tanks better suited to the terrain struck units that were already stretched thin and mechanically weakened. A tank that cannot maneuver well is vulnerable, no matter how thick its armor is. Deep snow limited movement to roads and known paths. That made armored units predictable. Anti-tank defenses could focus on choke points. Artillery could be pre-aimed at likely routes. Mines hidden beneath snow became even harder to detect. The environment began shaping tactics for both sides. 4 German tank crews. Even a short withdrawal could become a nightmare. Reversing through snow, turning heavy vehicles on icy ground, trying to avoid getting stuck, all under pressure, was far harder than advancing across dry fields months earlier. Breakdowns during retreats were especially dangerous. A disabled tank might have to be destroyed by its own crew to avoid capture. Explosives were set. Equipment was burned. Machines that had crossed half of Europe ended their journey in white fields, destroyed not by enemy fire, but by the inability to move. The numbers told a quiet story. Losses to mechanical failure and abandonment rose. Tanks listed as temporarily out of action often never returned. Workshops were overwhelmed. Spare parts were rationed. Some units operated with only a fraction of their original strength. And still, winter continued. Cold seeped into ammunition storage. Shell casings had to be handled carefully. Frost formed inside optics. Visibility through periscopes and sights was reduced by ice and condensation. Every task required more effort, more time, more patience, in a war that rewarded speed. Crews layered clothing under their uniforms, but thick gloves made fine mechanical work harder. Remove the gloves, and fingers went numb in minutes. Frostbite became as real a threat as enemy bullets. Exhaustion grew. Fighting the enemy is one kind of stress. Fighting the environment every single hour is another. Sleep was shorter. Repairs took longer. Confidence dropped. The tank, once a symbol of power, now felt like a burden that required constant attention just to keep alive. And while Germany struggled to keep its armored forces moving, Soviet industry, far from the front lines, continued producing large numbers of simpler, rugged tanks. They were not perfect. They had flaws of their own. But they were designed with harsh conditions in mind and built in huge numbers. Quantity began to meet endurance. Germany's tanks might have been technically superior in many ways, but superiority means little if half of them cannot move when needed. Winter exposed a harsh truth. The tank had been designed for a fast, decisive campaign in moderate conditions. It had not been built for a long war of survival in extreme cold, with stretched supply lines and constant shortages. The machine itself was not foolish. The assumptions behind its use were. As the months dragged on, the image of unstoppable armored columns gave way to a different reality. Scattered vehicles, overworked crews, and machines that needed more care than the army could provide. Winter did not defeat the tanks in a single dramatic moment. It wore them down. Slowly, quietly, relentlessly. And by the time the weather began to ease, the damage had already been done. The momentum that tanks were meant to create had faded. The advantage of surprise and speed was gone. The war in the East was no longer a rapid advance. It was a grinding struggle where endurance mattered more than brilliance. And endurance was exactly what Winter had tested and found lacking. The tank that could not handle winter had not just broken down mechanically. It had helped break the illusion that the campaign would be quick, easy, and unstoppable. Nature had stepped in and changed the pace of the war itself. Far from the battlefield, where guns thundered and tanks struggled through snow, another battle was being lost more quietly. The battle of supply. An army does not run only on courage and firepower. It runs on fuel, spare parts, food, ammunition, and the constant movement of trucks and trains that keep everything connected. Winter attacked all of it. Roads that were already poor turned into frozen ruts and ridges that shook vehicles apart. Snow buried landmarks and signs. Convoys moved slower, headlights dimmed in blizzards, drivers straining to see through swirling white. Engines in supply trucks faced the same problems as those in tanks. Oil thickened. Batteries weakened. Fuel systems froze. A truck that failed on a lonely road could block the path for others behind it, turning supply routes into long lines of stalled vehicles. Every delay at the rear echoed at the front. A tank waiting for a replacement part might sit idle for days. A unit short on fuel might cancel an operation. Ammunition deliveries slowed, forcing commanders to ration shells. The cold did not just freeze machines. It froze momentum. Railways, the backbone of long-distance transport, suffered too. Ice-clogged switches. Metal rails contracted and stressed under temperature changes. Snowdrifts blocked lines. Repair crews worked constantly in brutal conditions just to keep trains moving. But even when trains arrived, there were fewer resources to move. Factories far away struggled with their own shortages and bombing damage. Production slowed. What was built took longer to reach the front. Winter stretched every weakness wider. Then there was the human side of logistics. Drivers, mechanics, and railway workers faced the same freezing winds and biting cold as frontline soldiers, but without the recognition. Frostbite, illness, exhaustion, all reduced the workforce needed to keep supplies flowing. Repairing a truck engine in a warm workshop is difficult. Repairing it outdoors in sub-zero temperatures, with numb fingers and metal tools that stick to skin, is something else entirely. So breakdowns piled up. Vehicles that might have been repaired in hours sat for days. Spare parts were delayed. Improvised fixes became common. Reliability dropped even further. The system began to clog. Fuel was one of the greatest victims. Fuel had to move from distant sources, through refineries, along rail lines, onto trucks, and finally to the front. At every step, winter caused losses and delays. Storage containers cracked. Pumps failed. Lines froze. And fuel was not just for tanks. It powered trucks, generators, heaters, communication equipment, everything that made modern warfare possible. When fuel ran short, priorities had to be set. Some vehicles moved. Others stayed parked. Sometimes, tanks at the front had to remain still, not because they were damaged, but because the fuel meant for them had been delayed, lost, or frozen somewhere along the route. A powerful weapon without fuel is just heavy metal. Winter understood that perfectly. The same applied to spare parts. A small broken component could disable an entire vehicle. In theory, replacements existed. In reality, getting them through hundreds of kilometers of frozen terrain and damaged infrastructure was another challenge. So workshops became graveyards of half-repaired machines waiting for one missing piece. Cannibalization increased. One vehicle was stripped to keep another running. Numbers shrank not only from combat losses, but from a slow bleed of mechanical attrition. Meanwhile, the enemy's supply system, though not perfect, was shorter and better adapted to the environment. They operated closer to their factories. They used rail lines designed for local conditions. They had experience moving in winter. The balance shifted quietly, not just at the front, but along every road and track behind it. The tank that couldn't handle winter was only the most visible symptom. Behind it was an entire system struggling against temperature, distance, and exhaustion. Commanders began to realize that even the best designed machines meant little if the system feeding them could not survive the cold. Plans were scaled back. Ambitions lowered. Operations delayed. Not because of enemy strength alone, but because engines would not start, fuel would not arrive, and parts would not fit into place with frozen hands. Winter did not need to destroy every tank. It only needed to slow the system enough that the enemy could catch up. And once momentum was lost, regaining it in such conditions was almost impossible. The war that had begun with fast advances and roaring engines had slowed to a crawl of frozen metal, stalled convoys, and units waiting for supplies that moved through a white, unforgiving landscape. The tank had been built to carry the war forward. Now the war was being dragged down by everything behind it. By the time winter began to loosen its grip, the damage had already been done. Snow would eventually melt. Ice would thaw. Engines would start more easily again. But what winter had taken could not simply be restored with warmer weather. The tanks that had been abandoned in frozen fields were still gone. The spare parts used to keep others alive were already spent. The crews lost to exposure, illness, and exhaustion did not simply return when the temperature rose. Winter had not just frozen machines. It had drained strength. The tank that could not handle winter had been designed as a symbol of speed and shock. It was meant to break enemy lines and keep moving, never giving the other side time to breathe. Its power depended on momentum, on always going forward, always pressing, always exploiting weakness. Winter took away that momentum, and once it was gone, the nature of the war changed. Instead of sweeping advances, there were slow, grinding battles. Instead of rapid encirclements, there were defensive lines. Instead of confident thrusts into new territory, there were desperate efforts to hold what had already been taken. The tank still existed. It still had its gun, its armor, its presence. But it no longer carried the same promise. Because a tank that spends more time being repaired than moving, that burns precious fuel just to stay warm, that risks failing every time the engine is turned off, is no longer a weapon of decision. It becomes a burden that must be protected, supplied, and worried over. Winter revealed something deeper than a design flaw. It revealed a mismatch between ambition and reality. The campaign had been planned with speed in mind. Supplies, maintenance schedules, and vehicle preparation all reflected an expectation of a shorter war in milder conditions. When the war stretched on and the cold deepened, those assumptions collapsed. And when assumptions collapse in war, machines pay the price. The tank itself was not foolish. It was powerful, well-armed, and in many situations highly effective. But it was part of a larger system, a system that had not been built to endure such extremes for so long, so far from its base. Winter attacked that system from every angle. It shortened the life of engines. It increased fuel consumption. It slowed repairs. It broke supply lines. It exhausted crews. Each problem alone might have been manageable. Together, over months, they became overwhelming. The enemy did not need to destroy every tank in battle. Winter had already reduced how many could reach the battlefield in the first place. And while one side struggled to keep its machines alive in hostile conditions, the other adapted, endured, and built strength. When spring finally arrived, the battlefield did not reset to how it had been before the snow. The balance had shifted. Units that had once been full strength were now shadows of themselves. Experienced crews were fewer. Equipment stocks were lower. Confidence in rapid victory had faded. The tank that was supposed to help win a fast war had instead become part of a long, exhausting struggle it was never meant to fight. Nature had done what enemy fire alone could not. It had slowed a modern mechanized army until time itself became an enemy. And time, once lost, is almost impossible to regain. The story of the tank that couldn't handle winter is not just about frozen engines or cracked parts. It is about what happens when a powerful machine is pushed into conditions its creators did not fully prepare for. It is about how small mechanical weaknesses become major strategic problems when multiplied across thousands of vehicles and millions of frozen kilometers. It is about how nature, silent, indifferent, relentless, can reshape a war without firing a single shot. In photographs, the tank still looks formidable. Thick armor, long gun, steel tracks ready to bite into the earth. But those images do not show the mornings when engines refuse to start. They do not show crews lighting fires under frozen metal. They do not show vehicles left behind in white silence because they could not move another meter. They do not show how momentum, the true power of armored warfare, slowly bled away in the cold. In the end, the tank did not fail because it lacked strength. It failed because strength alone is not enough. A weapon must fit the world it fights in. It must match the terrain, the climate, the supply system, and the time available. When those things are ignored, even the most impressive machine can become fragile. Winter did not care about armor thickness or gun caliber. It only cared about temperature. And temperature, in that place and that year, proved stronger than steel. This is last story. I already know you slept. But this one is different. Because this weapon did not just fight on the battlefield. It fought in movie theaters. Before it ever fired a shot, before it ever faced the enemy, it was already winning wars on screen. Massive guns firing in slow motion. Tanks rolling through smoke. Rockets rising into the sky like something from the future. Crowds watched in silence. Newsreels showed power. Perfection. Invincibility. There was just one problem. The camera never showed what happened next. During the war, propaganda became a weapon as powerful as any gun. Film crews followed new machines, capturing dramatic angles, roaring engines, giant barrels pointing at the sky. Music swelled. Narrators spoke with confidence. These images were meant to do two things at once. Inspire hope at home. Spread fear abroad. A single shot of a giant weapon firing could be replayed again and again, presented as if it were changing the course of history. Viewers saw size, fire, speed, all the visible signs of strength. What they did not see were the breakdowns, the delays, the failures that happened when cameras were gone. One of the most famous examples was a weapon so large it barely looked real. When it appeared in propaganda films, it seemed like something out of myth, an enormous barrel mounted on rails, surrounded by tiny figures of soldiers for scale. The message was simple: this is unstoppable. The reality was slower, heavier, and far more fragile. Transporting this weapon required special tracks, careful planning, and days of preparation. It could not simply roll into battle. It had to be assembled, positioned, calibrated. Hundreds of men worked just to get it ready. And after all that work, it could fire only a limited number of shots before maintenance was needed again. Each shell was massive. Each firing required logistics that strained supply lines already under pressure. It looked like the ultimate symbol of power. But it was a weapon built for spectacle as much as strategy. When it fired, the blast was impressive. Cameras captured the recoil, the smoke, the echo rolling across the landscape. In film, it looked like the war itself paused to watch. But wars are not decided by how loud a single shot sounds. They are decided by what happens before and after. And before each dramatic firing sequence were hours of preparation, vulnerability, and exposure. Such a huge weapon could not hide easily. Aircraft could spot it. Artillery could target it. Its very size made it a risk. Yet on film, it never looked at risk. Propaganda carefully selected what the audience saw. Perfect angles. Perfect timing. No mud, no mechanical delays, no exhausted crews waiting for replacement parts. The weapon became a symbol. A promise. Proof, it seemed, that technology would crush the enemy through sheer scale. But scale has a cost. The resources used to build, transport, and protect one gigantic weapon could have supported many smaller, more flexible systems. Time spent setting up a single dramatic strike was time not spent elsewhere. The enemy did not stop moving while cameras rolled. They adapted, relocated, returned fire. And often, by the time these spectacular weapons were ready to act again, the situation on the ground had already changed. Still, the films continued. Clips were edited. Victories emphasized. Limitations erased. A handful of dramatic moments were stretched into the illusion of constant dominance. For civilians far from the front, it worked. The weapon looked unstoppable. The nation looked strong. The future looked secure. For soldiers who had to operate it, the story felt different. They knew how often things went wrong, how weather delayed firing, how parts wore out, how much effort was needed for results that were sometimes smaller than expected. But their reality did not make it to the screen. And this gap between image and truth became one of the most dangerous illusions of the war. Because leaders who believed their own propaganda sometimes made decisions based on how weapons looked, not how they actually performed. A weapon that seemed terrifying in film could be treated as a war winner, even if in practice it was slow, limited, and vulnerable. The camera created confidence. Reality created strain. And the wider this gap grew, the more the war was guided by appearances instead of logistics, maintenance, and practicality. The weapon looked perfect in black and white. But war is not filmed in perfect lighting. It is fought in mud, snow, smoke, and confusion. Where size can become a weakness, complexity becomes delay, and dramatic power does not always mean real effectiveness. The audience saw thunder. The crews saw long nights of work just to make the thunder happen once. And this was only the beginning, because the same story would repeat with tanks that looked invincible on parade, aircraft that looked unstoppable in staged footage, and rockets that looked like the future rising into the sky. Again and again, the image would travel faster than the truth. And by the time reality caught up, it was often too late. This time, the camera turned towards steel monsters on tracks. They rolled forward in black and white film, engines roaring, smoke curling around their silhouettes. Their armor looked thick enough to stop anything. Their guns looked long enough to reach across entire battlefields. In propaganda footage, they never seemed to stop. They advanced through ruined villages, across open fields, through dust and fire. Enemy positions exploded as shells landed. Narrators spoke of invincible armored divisions, unstoppable momentum, machines that no defense could withstand. The message was simple. These tanks could not be defeated. But the camera never followed them for long. It never stayed when the engines overheated. It never filmed the breakdowns on narrow roads. It never showed crews waiting beside silent machines, hoping recovery vehicles would arrive before enemy artillery did. On film, tanks were symbols of speed and strength. In reality, they were heavy machines fighting physics every hour they moved. Many of these armored vehicles were engineering achievements. Powerful guns, thick armor, complex transmissions designed to handle enormous weight. They were built to dominate one-on-one engagements, to outgun and outlast enemy vehicles. And in certain situations, they did. But war is not a parade ground, and film is not reality. A tank that looks terrifying when driving past a camera at full speed can look very different after days of hard travel over broken roads. Dust clogs filters. Engines strain. Suspension systems wear down. Tracks stretch and require constant adjustment. Every kilometer adds stress. And the heavier the tank, the more that stress multiplies. Bridges became a problem. Some were too weak to support the weight. Routes had to be changed. Engineers had to check crossings in advance. Movement slowed. Mud became a problem. Heavy tanks sank deeper, needed more power to move, burned more fuel just to crawl forward. Recovery became harder. A stuck light vehicle might be pulled free quickly. A stuck heavy tank could require multiple machines working together, if they were available. Fuel itself became another hidden weakness. Large engines meant high consumption. The more impressive the tank looked on film, the more fuel it demanded behind the scenes. Supply lines stretched thinner trying to keep these machines running. When fuel ran short, the most powerful tanks sometimes stayed parked while lighter vehicles kept moving. But propaganda never filmed idle tanks waiting for fuel. It filmed motion. Then there was maintenance. Complex vehicles require constant care. Gearboxes needed attention. Engines needed regular servicing. Parts wore out under the stress of weight and recoil. A tank that had fought well yesterday might need hours, sometimes days, of work before it could fight again. Field workshops were overwhelmed. Mechanics worked long hours, often outdoors, often under threat of attack. Spare parts did not always arrive on time. Improvised repairs became common. A machine that looked indestructible from the outside might be held together by exhausted crews doing their best with limited tools. The camera did not stay for that either. Inside the tank, the experience was far from the confident image shown in films. Crews operated in cramped, noisy conditions. Heat from the engine mixed with smoke from the gun. Visibility was limited. Communication depended on radios that could fail or be disrupted. Every movement required coordination between driver, gunner, loader, and commander. When the tank moved, every bump and turn stressed the machine. When it fired, recoil shook components. When it stopped, crews listened for strange sounds, signs of problems that could leave them stranded later. And being stranded in a heavy tank was dangerous. A disabled tank is a target. If it cannot move, it becomes easier to hit with artillery or anti-tank weapons. Crews sometimes had to abandon vehicles that could not be repaired quickly, destroying them to prevent capture. Those moments did not make it into the newsreels. What made it into films were the rare moments when everything worked perfectly at the same time. A clean advance, a powerful shot, a dramatic explosion in the distance. Viewers saw strength. They did not see how rare those perfect moments could be. There was also the matter of numbers. Heavy, complex tanks took longer to build. They required more materials, more skilled labor, more time per vehicle. While they looked terrifying, they were never as numerous as simpler machines on the other side. So even when a powerful tank won a local engagement, it could not be everywhere at once. But on film, numbers were an illusion. One tank filmed from different angles could look like many. Careful editing created the impression of endless armored waves, when in reality, each loss hurt far more than the audience could imagine. The image of invincibility became so strong that even enemy soldiers sometimes overestimated the threat. Reports spoke of unstoppable armor, super heavy machines that could not be stopped. Fear spread faster than facts. And fear, like propaganda, can be powerful. But fear does not repair engines. Fear does not deliver fuel. Fear does not replace broken parts. The gap between appearance and reality kept widening. Leaders saw impressive footage and believed in technological superiority. Civilians saw strength and believed victory was certain. But at the front, crews saw the truth. Powerful machines that demanded constant effort just to stay operational. The tank that looked like a steel monster on screen could feel like a fragile system of parts that might fail at the worst moment. And when failures came, they came without dramatic music or slow-motion explosions. Just a grinding sound, a loss of power, a track thrown off in mud, a gearbox that refused to shift. Moments when the illusion vanished, and the crew inside realized that the machine everyone feared could still be stopped by something as simple as a broken component. The camera never lingered on those silences. But those silences were becoming more common. And as the war dragged on, the difference between how these tanks looked and how they actually performed began shaping decisions at the highest levels. Because when leaders believe their own images, they may send machines into situations where reality cannot support the myth. And the myth cannot drive on broken tracks. The camera loved aircraft. Nothing looked more modern, more powerful, more unstoppable than machines slicing through the sky. Propellers spinning, sunlight flashing on wings, formations stretching across the horizon like mechanical birds of prey. In propaganda films, aircraft were shown diving through clouds, releasing bombs with perfect accuracy, then climbing away untouched. Fighters streaked past the camera, guns blazing, always victorious, always returning home. From the ground, they looked like complete control of the air. From inside the cockpit, the story was more fragile. Aircraft were among the most complex machines of the war. Engines pushed to their limits. Fuel systems under constant strain. Weapons mounted into thin frames of aluminum and steel. Every mission added wear. Every landing tested the machine. But the films never showed the long hours before takeoff. They didn't show mechanics working in cold winds or muddy airfields, trying to keep engines running with limited spare parts. They didn't show the arguments over which aircraft could fly and which had to be grounded for repairs. In footage, squadrons looked endless. In reality, serviceable planes were often fewer than expected. Engines overheated. Oil leaked. Spark plugs fouled. Hydraulic lines cracked. A plane that looked sleek and perfect from a distance might be flying with minor issues that could become major problems mid-air. Pilots knew this. Every takeoff was a small act of faith, not just in their skill, but in the condition of the machine beneath them. Propaganda showed perfect formations. Reality included aircraft turning back early, instruments malfunctioning, or weapons jamming at crucial moments. Bombers in films flew in clean daylight, tight groups, bombs dropping in dramatic sequences. In combat, weather interfered. Clouds hid targets. Icing formed on wings. Turbulence shook aircraft, making accurate bombing harder. Navigation errors sent formations off course. Sometimes bombs landed far from intended targets. But those misses did not appear on screen. Fighters looked invincible in staged footage, swooping down and climbing away without a scratch. But air combat was chaotic. Speeds were high, decisions split-second. A small mechanical issue, a drop in engine power, a jammed gun, a faulty radio, could turn advantage into disaster. And then there was landing. Landing an aircraft after a mission was one of the most dangerous moments. Fuel low, nerves high, damage sometimes hidden. Landing gear could fail. Brakes could malfunction. A plane that survived enemy fire could be lost on the runway. Those crashes were rarely filmed. The camera preferred triumphant returns, planes taxiing in, crews smiling, ground staff cheering. But behind the scenes, mechanics worked non-stop to keep aging machines in the air. Spare parts became harder to find. Repairs took longer. Cannibalizing damaged aircraft to keep others flying became common. So while propaganda suggested growing air power, the reality in some units was shrinking readiness. The illusion of control in the sky hid a daily struggle against wear, damage, and shortages. Even the most advanced aircraft faced limits. Engines designed for performance sometimes had short lifespans. Pushing them too hard could cause failure. Pilots were told to be careful with throttle, to avoid sudden changes, to nurse their engines. Instructions that didn't always fit the chaos of combat. A fighter that looked like pure speed in a film might be flying with an engine already near its limit. And if that engine failed at altitude, the pilot might not make it home. But films did not show forced landings behind enemy lines. They did not show pilots waiting beside damaged planes in remote fields, hoping rescue would come before capture. They showed victory passes and dramatic dives. The sky on screen looked controlled, almost choreographed. The real sky was unpredictable, dangerous, and unforgiving. And just like with tanks and giant guns, the image of unstoppable air power began to influence decisions. Leaders saw footage of sleek aircraft and believed in dominance. Civilians saw it and believed their skies were secure. But air power depends on more than speed and appearance. It depends on fuel deliveries, spare engines, trained mechanics, safe airfields, weather forecasts, navigation aids, all the quiet systems that keep planes flying. When those systems strained, readiness dropped. Aircraft that looked terrifying in propaganda films might spend more time on the ground than in the air. And an aircraft on the ground, no matter how advanced, controls nothing. The camera never lingered on empty runways where planes should have been. It never showed the growing gap between how many aircraft existed and how many could actually fly on a given day. But pilots and ground crews knew. They lived in that gap. They knew that a machine that looked perfect from a distance could fail because of one cracked line, one worn part, one engine pushed too hard too many times. And in the sky, there is no pulling over to the side of the road. When the illusion met gravity, gravity always won. By this point in the war, the films began to change. No longer just tanks and aircraft. Now the screen filled with things that looked like they belonged to another century. Sleek rockets standing tall against the sky. Strange experimental aircraft with unusual shapes. Weapons introduced with dramatic music and words like revolutionary and decisive. The message was clear. The future had arrived, and it belonged to them. One of the most powerful images in these films was the rocket. Cameras captured it standing upright, surrounded by scaffolding and engineers who looked tiny beside it. Smoke drifted across the launch site. Then fire erupted beneath it, and the machine rose into the sky like a metal spear leaving the earth. To audiences watching in dark theaters, it looked unstoppable. A weapon that could strike from impossible distances. A symbol that science itself had joined the war. The camera showed ignition, liftoff, a streak disappearing into the clouds. Then the film cut away. It never showed the rockets that exploded on the launch pad. It never showed the ones that veered off course. It never showed the long hours of preparation for a single launch. Behind every dramatic liftoff were countless technical challenges. Fuel mixtures had to be precise. Guidance systems were delicate and often unreliable. Small errors could cause total failure. The fuels themselves were dangerous, highly volatile. Crews worked in protective gear, aware that a leak or spark could cause disaster. Accidents happened. Not all of them were small, but accidents were not part of the image. On film, rockets always worked. In reality, they worked just often enough to keep hope alive. Each rocket required enormous effort to build. Specialized parts, skilled technicians, careful assembly. And after launch, there was nothing to recover, nothing to reuse. It was a weapon that consumed resources in a single moment. The spectacle was enormous. The strategic impact was limited. Rockets were aimed at cities, not precise military targets. They created fear, destruction, and shock, but they did not stop advancing armies. They did not repair damaged supply lines. They did not protect factories from bombing. Still, on screen, they looked like war-winning miracles. The same was true of experimental aircraft shown in carefully staged footage. Strange shapes, swept wings, engines that looked new and futuristic. Pilots climbing in with confidence. Takeoffs filmed from dramatic angles. But the camera rarely stayed long enough to show how difficult these machines were to operate. Some required long runways and perfect conditions. Some had engines with short operational lifespans. Some were so new that even experienced pilots had limited training with them. A plane that looked like the future might spend most of its time grounded, waiting for parts or repairs. Yet in propaganda films, it flew endlessly. Editing created continuity where reality had gaps. A single successful test flight could be cut into a sequence that suggested regular operational use. Viewers saw smooth landings, confident crews, and shining metal. They did not see the prototypes that crashed. They did not see the pilots who refused to fly certain machines again. They did not see engineers arguing over problems that had no quick solution. The image of technological superiority grew stronger with each film. And the more it grew, the more dangerous it became, because the illusion began to replace honest assessment. Leaders saw images of advanced rockets and aircraft and believed time was on their side, that breakthrough weapons were just around the corner, ready to change everything. But breakthrough weapons do not fight alone. They need production lines, training programs, fuel, maintenance networks, time to refine designs. All of these were in short supply. So the future appeared on screen, while the present struggled on the ground. The rockets looked unstoppable as they rose into the sky, but each launch site was vulnerable. Each transport convoy carrying parts or fuel could be attacked. Each delay meant fewer launches than promised. The experimental aircraft looked dominant as they flashed past the camera, but many airfields lacked the resources to keep them flying regularly. Engines wore out, parts failed, mechanics worked miracles just to prepare a handful for missions. On film, it seemed like a new era of warfare had begun. In reality, the old problems remained. Fuel shortages, bombed factories, overstretched supply lines, tired crews. Technology leapt forward in isolated moments. The system supporting it lagged behind. And still, the camera kept rolling, because the image of hope was powerful. It reassured civilians. It intimidated enemies. It convinced decision-makers that victory might still be achieved through one final leap of innovation. But war does not bend to appearances. A weapon shown once on film might look like a game-changer. A weapon that cannot be produced, maintained, and deployed in numbers becomes a symbol, impressive, memorable, but strategically limited. The rockets, the experimental jets, the secret projects all shared one thing. They looked like the future, but they were fighting in a present that was running out of time, resources, and stability. And the further the image drifted from reality, the harder it became to see the truth clearly. Because when a nation starts believing its own carefully edited images, it can mistake spectacle for strength, and spectacle does not win long wars. By now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The guns looked unstoppable on film. The tanks looked invincible. The aircraft looked dominant. The rockets looked like the future rising into the sky. On screen, victory always seemed just one breakthrough away. But behind the camera, reality was growing heavier, slower, more fragile. Factories struggled to replace losses. Supply lines thinned. Fuel ran short. Skilled workers and experienced crews became harder to find. Machines that looked perfect in carefully edited sequences were often sitting idle, waiting for parts that would never arrive. Propaganda showed motion. Reality showed strain. And the more the image of power was repeated, the more dangerous it became, because people began to believe it completely. Civilians believed their side still held secret advantages that would turn everything around. Soldiers hoped the next new weapon would finally make the difference. Leaders convinced themselves that just a little more time, just one more technological leap, would change the outcome. But war is not won by isolated moments of brilliance. It is won by systems that keep working day after day. And those systems were cracking. The weapons in the films were real. They existed, they fired, they flew, they launched. But they existed in numbers too small, with support too weak, and in a situation already slipping out of control. The camera captured the best moments. War is mostly made of the worst ones. The long hours of maintenance. The delays. The shortages. The machines that never made it to the front. The crews waiting beside equipment that would not start. None of that made it into the dramatic footage shown to the world. So a strange thing happened. The image of strength became stronger. At the same time, real strength was fading. Propaganda did not just try to fool the enemy. It began to fool the people using the weapons too. And that may have been the most powerful illusion of all. Because when leaders believe their own staged images, they may choose spectacle over practicality, complexity over reliability, dramatic impact over steady endurance. The weapons look terrifying in propaganda films, but fear on screen does not repair engines. It does not fill fuel tanks. It does not rebuild factories. It does not shorten supply lines. The camera can make a single machine look like an army. Reality counts every missing vehicle. And in the end, the war was decided not by the most dramatic weapon, not by the loudest explosion, not by the machine that looked most impressive in black and white. It was decided by which side could keep producing, repairing, supplying, and adapting, even when conditions were bad, even when losses were heavy. The weapons of spectacle became symbols. The weapons of reliability became the ones that kept showing up. And that is the quiet twist behind all those powerful images. The machines that looked like they would win the war were often the ones least able to carry its weight. The screen showed confidence. The battlefield demanded endurance. And endurance, not spectacle, decides history. So the next time you see those old films, the giant guns firing, the tanks rolling through smoke, the rockets climbing into the sky, remember that you are watching a carefully chosen moment. A moment designed to inspire, to intimidate, to convince. But behind every dramatic shot was a much longer story of effort, limitation, and a reality far less perfect than the camera allowed. And sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is not the machine, it's the image. This is all for this video. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the weapons that looked terrifying on screen but struggled in reality, make sure you subscribe for more long, immersive World War II stories like this. There's always another machine, another promise, and another hidden truth behind the history. And in the next story, the illusion might be even bigger.